So welcome everyone to tonight's Gallier Gathering lecture. My name is Dr. Amy Catherine Medvick, and I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves two 19th century New Orleans homes and, through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. We invite you to come visit us next time you're in the French Quarter. This event is made possible by funding from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Funding for 2021 Rebirth Grants has been administered by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan and the NEH Sustaining the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan Initiative. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Kevin McQueeney is an assistant professor of history and the coordinator of the Black Studies Certificate Program at Nicholls State University. He received his doctorate in history from Georgetown University and a master's degree in history at the University of New Orleans. Kevin specializes in African American history, history of New Orleans, and the history of medicine. The University of North Carolina Press will publish his book, A City Without Care, 300 Years of Racism, Health Disparities, and Healthcare Activism in New Orleans in spring 2023. At tonight's Gallier Gathering, Dr. McQueeney will address the history of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, a New Orleans-based parade crew and community organization. He will discuss the organization's evolution from its founding as the city's first African American Mardi Gras crew in 1909, through the struggles of Hurricane Katrina and COVID-19. In particular, the talk will focus on two significant events: the Blackout, a civil rights boycott of Mardi Gras in the 1960s, and controversy over a planned trip to South Africa during apartheid in 1986. We will be hosting a Q&A at the end of the lecture. Please use the Q&A function on your screen to submit questions rather than the chat. We can't guarantee that we're going to be able to address all the questions in the chat. So please use that function. And we will have roughly half an hour to 45 minutes for Q&A at the end. Now, before we get started, some of you might be wondering why Mardi Gras in August. As a scholar of carnivals myself, in my case, the Carnival of Northeast Brazil, likewise celebrated in February or early March, I know firsthand that pre-Lenten festivities are in reality not limited to the pre-Lenten season. They tend to shape the year-round economy, social world, and identity of the places that celebrate them, and the work of preparing for parades and performances takes months. In many cases, some of the most treasured cultural practices of the celebration are performed by the most marginalized members of that society, who may struggle to find support and resources during the times of year when the public's attention is elsewhere. This is certainly the case in Brazil. For these reasons, and because we could all probably enjoy a little Midsummer Mardi Gras, I would like us to give a warm welcome to Dr. Kevin McQueeney.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the LEH for sponsoring these events. It's exciting to be here and to be able to share some of my research. I want to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. I will be talking about Zulu, the Social Aid and Pleasure Club, and the Mardi Gras parade crew, but I also feel it's important to note that I'm a white scholar, and Zulu is historically African American social aid and pleasure club. I've lived in New Orleans for about 12 years, but obviously this is going to be a talk about a pretty historic institution within New Orleans, and like I said, an institution that has historically been African American and for many decades was kind of marginalized. So I want to note that, especially because I'm going to be talking about the history of this organization, and I'm going to be approaching it as an outsider, as a researcher, as a historian. And some of the topics that I'm going to bring up can somewhat be controversial, and I'm not bringing them up to critique or to criticize the organization or supporters of it, but to kind of unpack the history of this particular organization. So I'm going to share my screen and this will work. All right. Yeah, the talk tonight will be about the history of the Zulu Mardi Gras Krewe, also Social Aid and Pleasure Club. I'm going to talk about the history of this organization, the evolution of it, and some of the enduring elements of the parade crew, as well as some of the controversies that have remained about this particular organization and its performance at Mardi Gras. For those of you who are not familiar with Zulu, depicted on left, Zulu is, I think, one of the kind of iconic images, iconic parade crews for Mardi Gras. They parade on Mardi Gras Day. A lot of New Orleanians, this is kind of how you get your start to Mardi Gras, is you go to watch the Zulu parade, and you try to catch one of their treasured throws, the Zulu coconut, which is depicted on the right. They have a pretty, famous look. As we can see here, some of the elements that I'll talk about today, the individuals with black paint on their faces and white around the eyes and the mouth, the grass skirts. A lot of them will also carry things like spears, and they will have floats that will be depictions of jungle scenes. These are some of the kind of images that get associated with Zulu, and I'll talk a little bit about their history. And I'll go even further back, because this is what historians like to do, is we like to kind of push everything back. For those of you who are not familiar with Mardi Gras at all, Mardi Gras is a season that starts January 6th. So even though we're in August, New Orleanians are getting ready to, we're starting right now to get back into festival seasons. Just in a couple months, we'll be starting Mardi Gras season. So the season starts traditionally January 6th, which is known as Epiphany or Three Kings Day. And it'll last Mardi Gras Day, which is also known as Fat Tuesday, and it's the day before Ash Wednesday. Mardi Gras was first celebrated in North America on March 3rd, 1699, when the French-Canadian explorer Iberville held an event to mark that day. And he holds this event about 60 miles from New Orleans. The city itself of New Orleans was founded in 1718 and almost immediately starts celebrating Mardi Gras festivities. The city's first recorded street parade occurred in 1837, and the first Mardi Gras crew, and a crew is a term for an organization. And so this first Mardi Gras crew, which is Comus, is formed in 1857. They will hold their own parade and a ball, and they will be followed by the crews of Rex and of Momus. Rex is founded in 1872. It's also probably one of the most kind of iconic crews organizations that is associated with the history of Mardi Gras. They are founded in an effort actually to entertain Russia's Grand Duke Romanov during his visit to the city of New Orleans, to attract visitors to New Orleans, and to provide a daytime parade, because for many years, the festivities around Mardi Gras could get a little raucous. And so under the Americans and the Spanish previously, the officials had banned the celebrations for Mardi Gras because things got a little too out of hand. So they start this crew, they start these parades to try to offer a kind of little less raucous celebration of this. And they begin this in the 1870s, and it's something that will last to the present. In 1873, they begin this tradition of holding a ball, and they select a king and a queen of carnival. And they have a royal court, and you can see some of their elements that are depicted here that will typically feature a king, a duke, a queen, a baron, a count, a knight, a page, all the kind of elements of a traditional kind of medieval court. Here's some of the pictures of Mardi Gras from 1880. Some of the celebrations there at this corner of Canal Street during the Rex Parade. And as you can see, these are drawing in large numbers of New Orleanians and later on visitors, especially as New Orleans increasingly turns towards its tourism economy in the early 20th century. This is a depiction of people waiting to see the arrival of Rex. And this is Rex will kind of come ashore and start this kind of formal celebration of Mardi Gras. And this will be something that will also become associated with Zulu, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. So just some notes about the early Mardi Gras crews. They are all male, they are all white. African Americans will join ward clubs, local neighborhood organizations, and social and benevolent associations, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Some of these groups will march in Black neighborhoods during Mardi Gras, but they are not permitted to parade in white neighborhoods. So Rex is having its parades, Rex is doing its Mardi Gras elements, as depicted here right around the turn of the 20th century. So this is kind of what you would see, these floats. African Americans are excluded from this, especially as the city becomes increasingly racially segregated over the course of the early 20th century. In 1901, one group of African Americans known as the Tramps reportedly parades for the first time. In line with their name, the group wore costumes of white shirts, ragged pants, and straw hats. According to most sources, in 1909, the Tramps attended a show at the Elysian Theater in the Pythian Temple. This is the building depicted on your screen. This is a 27-story building opened in 1909 by the Grand Lodge of the Knights of Pythias of Louisiana, which is a Black fraternal organization. And this is an important building in the history of New Orleans. It houses local Black businesses and physicians, along with a meeting space for the Grand Lodge and the theater where they see this performance. The performance that they see is put on by a group known as the Southern Smart Set. This is an African American touring review company that is fronted by Sherman H. Dudley, depicted on the right. This group is a vaudeville act. Vaudeville is a form of entertainment popular in America from the 1880s through the 1920s. Vaudeville is typically a variety show. So usually you have a dozen or more acts over the course of several hours, where you have music and dance and comedy sketches and physical routines. And the Southern Smart Set, that's what they're performing. That's what they're putting on for this audience, which includes the Tramps in 1909. Vaudeville also incorporates elements of what are known as minstrel shows. Minstrel shows are a form of entertainment that gets started in the 1830s. It typically features white performers with blackened faces, usually some type of burnt cork or shoe polish, and tattered clothing, who will imitate and mock enslaved Africans on Southern plantations. These performances typically display African Americans as racial stereotypes, as lazy or as ignorant or superstitious, prone to thievery or cowardice. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, known as the father of minstrelsy, develops the first popularly known blackface character, Jim Crow, in 1830, which is where we get the name for the Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow period of the late 19th century. It's a popular form of entertainment through the Civil War, remains popular into the early 20th century. And in this post-emancipation period, whites will employ minstrelsy built on racial stereotypes to support white supremacy in the United States. And blackface, as we can see here, this is one of the key elements of this. And it's a hallmark of minstrelsy and will remain a popular form of American entertainment into the 20th century. So it's an important element to kind of understand, because this will be one of the key elements that the African American performers will see and will utilize. So the Southern Smart Set, that African American crew, they employ elements of vaudeville and minstrelsy, including blackface, even though they are Black actors. For them, it may have been a way to mock the caricature of African Americans, the way that whites are depicting African Americans. So it's pretty meta. It's a lot of layers. Here's a Black troupe kind of mocking the vaudeville or minstrelsy performances of white actors by putting on the elements that you would find in a minstrelsy show or a vaudeville show, and then kind of going through the same routines. The performance that night, which is entitled the Star of Zanzibar, includes an element, an act entitled There Will Never Was or Will Be a King Like Me, which features a Zulu king and warriors. The Star of Zanzibar tells the story of Black American campaigning for African Americans to move to Africa as a solution to racial animosity. And when he gets to Africa, he encounters cannibals, and they think he's a king, so they don't eat him and they make him the king. This is kind of has some interesting elements to unpack here. So first thing to note, the tramps who are watching this and then will create their element, the Zulus, based upon this performance. They're creating their performance of Zulu based on a vaudeville act. Second thing is the vaudeville players are African Americans performing at an African American entertainment venue. And the third thing is the Black troupe is wearing blackface. So again, a lot of elements to unpack here. So the vaudeville performance that's being put on, it's kind of mirroring a lot of the tropes that you would typically see by white performers in minstrelsy shows or vaudeville shows that are depicting African Americans as kind of, like I said, as inept or lazy or as unintelligent. And one way that African Americans would kind of parody this is they would then put on their own performances where they would parody people from Africa to differentiate themselves and say, here's where African Americans are actually somehow more civilized or advanced than people from Africa. These performances are pretty typical in the late 19th, early 20th century. Become very popular. One of the most popular performances is put on by Burt Williams and George Walker's In Dahomey, which is depicted here, which again tells the story of a syndicate hoping to colonize West Africa for Black expatriates. When they get to Africa, it's not what they imagine. The scheme goes awry. And the Star of Zanzibar, that performance by the Southern Smart Set, follows this script with exaggeration and mockery of Africans, a way of differentiating African Americans from Africans. In 1956, Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club president Jim Russell told the Pittsburgh Courier, presumably based on oral tradition, that the actors in 1909 performed in blackface with white rings around the eyes and noses and mouth, with mossy wigs and grass skirts. And these elements will become the key features of the Zulu performance when they parade. The staging of Zulus is really popular in the United States into this time period. And it extends beyond vaudeville acts. Part of it is based upon just kind of newspaper descriptions. In 1879, there's widespread newspaper coverage of the Anglo-Zulu War, which is a conflict initiated due to the British desire to gain more territory in Zululand in South Africa, what will become South Africa. And their interest in destroying the Zulu kingdom as a threat to the British hegemony in Africa. The Zulus are part of an ethnic group that migrates from the Congo River Basin to what is known as the KwaZulu-Natal in the 16th century. They're originally a pastoral group of cattle herders and grain farmers. They're comprised of individual family groups. It's unknown when they start to refer to themselves as Zulus. They become consolidated in the late 18th century and under increasingly more powerful chiefs. And the most famous chief is going to be Shaka, later on known Shaka Zulu. And he reorganizes the Zulus and is a very powerful military leader and forms them under a unified Zulu nation. And the Zulu nation is kind of renowned and feared for their military prowess, and they control the largest empire in southeastern Africa. And they do end up increasingly in conflicts with the British under their colonialism. And you'll have a conflict between the British and the Zulus starting in 1879. And newspapers throughout the world will cover this conflict, including in New Orleans, where people will be inundated. I did a count once of the New Orleans Daily Democrat, and this newspaper alone runs 189 articles in a 14-month period talking about this conflict between the British and the Zulus. It typically feeds into kind of notions of white supremacy, of the Zulus depicted as these powerful warriors, but not intelligent, not civilized, the British as these kind of advanced civilized group. So here is the whites versus this kind of backward warrior culture. And it really gets increasingly covered into this. So much so that Zulu becomes kind of part of the popular lexicon in America, including in New Orleans. It's a metaphor. A lot of times it will become used in newspapers in New Orleans as a metaphor for concepts of ignorance. One article said it's as useless to a New York City directory would be to a Zulu. It becomes kind of a stand-in for somebody who's ignorant. It's often used to describe athletes, like a boxer after he won a title fight was described as a wild-eyed, bloodthirsty Zulu warrior. Other writers would employ the terms to describe bloodthirsty individuals, right? Some writers would use the term to talk about the opulence of Zulu chiefs and how they would have these really kind of rich, opulent surroundings around them and have jewels and gold. So it's probably not a universal idea, but by the early 20th century, people, especially white, middle, and upper class individuals who are consuming media or reading newspapers, they think they understand what it means to be a Zulu, at least according to their popular conception, right? And for them, it's this gaudy, simple-minded, backwards, but brave and violent warrior. And as a result of this, you start to see stage performances of Zulu warriors, both of ethnic South African Zulus brought to America after the Anglo-Zulu War, and then costume depictions by African Americans or by white actors in blackface. You do increasingly see this in the 1880s, 1890s, into the early 20th century, where showmen will exhibit Zulus, or at least so-called Zulu warriors for American audiences, including P.T. Barnum. He includes Zulus in his Circuses Among the Curiosities, and the group will tour North America. Other circuses will soon feature Zulus as this kind of exotic other. However, as just a note, not all the performers are Zulus. A lot of them are actually African Americans. They're also displayed at the Chicago World Fair in 1893. And again, they are displayed similar to how they're displaying kind of animals or this kind of destruction of uncivilized societies, this historic remnants. Zulus are kind of put on as part of this. So here are all these elements that go into this performance that the Zulus are going to be putting on, and that the Tramps are seeing in 1909 when they go to this vaudeville show put on by the Southern Smart Set, and then seeing this performance, The Star of Zanzibar, with African Americans in blackface and grass skirts and these kind of stereotypical depictions of African Zulu warriors. And a lot of these elements will get incorporated into the performance of Zulu. So in 1909, the Tramps, after watching this performance, will parade a Zulu for the first time. Their early performances are limited by funds. Like I said, they're a lower income group, but they will incorporate many of the elements that we typically will associate with Zulu. Like Rex, they have a royalty, including a king. They really follow what they saw on this vaudeville show. William King served as Zulu's first king. For his royal costume, he wore a lard can for a crown, which is either a reflection of kind of the low income status of the group or kind of a parody, a mockery of this vaudeville performance, or some people say it's even kind of a mocking of Rex and their king. He also has a banana stalk as a scepter. He's got a burlap sack as a cape. All the marchers will dress in blackface. These are the basic elements that Zulu will continue to display for decades and largely remain unchanged. In 1915, the crew parades its first float. It's one float. In subsequent years, they will get more money, they'll have better funding, much more elaborate costumes, add more floats, but they stick to the original message employed in 1909. By the end of the 1910s, the crew had established a mythology behind the king. Members of the organization told children that the parade's king lived in the legendary Zululand in Africa and sailed on his royal yacht for New Orleans. Starting the day after Christmas, he arrives on the morning of Fat Tuesday on the New Basin Canal at Howard Ave and South Rampart Street. And so here's what you can see depicted on that screen on right, King Zulu arriving for the start of this. I'll go back to this slide here. So the royalty depicted in the center, this is probably what Zulu would have looked like around 1920. So this is around circa 1920. We know that in the 1920s, the king wore a grass skirt, black tights with painted green and red streaks, a tin crown, a broomstick with a stuffed white rooster as a scepter, and blackface with white around the eyes and mouth, as well as green and red circles and lines. And later the king's crown switched to gold and he adds a rabbit skin vest. The early royal entourage also included a queen, which until the 1930s was a man dressed up in women's clothing, and then a crown prince, a grand duke, and other main characters will be added in the 1930s, including a witch doctor and later the African big shot. They are really incorporating a lot of the elements of vaudeville. In 1921, the Times-Picayune describes minstrels playing instruments and singing, quote, plantation melodies, noted as the king's favorite music to greet the monarch. They've got a brass band, classic element of New Orleans, that will lead the king. He supposedly has 50 warriors in full war paint and carrying spears, and they will parade. These floats that you can see here, they will include wild mountain goats, coconut trees, vineyards, and all the floats are furnished to have the appearance of what the WPA's New Orleans City Guide calls, quote, a hometown jungle inhabited by jungle beasts. And they'll distribute coconuts to the spectators. The parade ends with a masked ball. Many people have claimed that Zulu is a parody of the previously detailed Krewe of Rex, which features their own royal court, including the king who does arrive on Mardi Gras Day. But based on what we know of the origin of the Krewe, on the oral histories of its early members, it's largely a construct of the trope of Zulu based on popular conceptions of what a Zulu warrior was in the early 20th century, heavily influenced by the vaudeville acts like the Southern Smart Sets, Star of Zanzibar. Part of this is a reflection of the fact that in the early 20th century, there's not much real ties to South Africa. New Orleans and South Africa did have some limited commercial ties that really ends in the early 1900s. But beyond this, beyond some basic shipping, there's not a lot of direct knowledge of this. And so this is really the popular conception of what a Zulu or South African is. In 1916, beyond the Mardi Gras element, Zulu carries out a really significant function, and they incorporate it as a social aid and pleasure club. And here's their mission statement. For social purposes, to establish between its members ties of friendship and sociability, to establish between them aid and esteem for the promotion of good fellowship, and friendly intercourse between the members and their guests. For those of you not familiar with social aid and pleasure clubs, these are examples of a Black fraternal organization. These are organizations that get started largely in the late 19th and early 20th century. They are organizations that get formed because African Americans are mostly excluded from life insurance policies. So life insurance organizations, primarily founded and funded by whites, deny African Americans life insurance policies. And as a result, African Americans, when they have a funeral, they get hit with these heavy costs. So African Americans form these self-help organizations, these fraternal organizations, including social aid and pleasure clubs, partially to pay for funeral expenses and to provide some type of benefits to the members' family upon their death. Some of these organizations will also have doctors that will provide medical care. They will have gatherings, picnics and parades and second lines and many of the kind of classic elements that are designed to foster community and also to help out the members of the organization. And they're key elements of the New Orleans African American community in the 19th and 20th century. It's important to understand the context of what's going on when this organization is being founded in 1910s, 1920s. New Orleans is becoming increasingly racially segregated. So this is what's happening as Zulu is forming. You start to see this organization founded to try to help out African Americans to form some type of self-help in the wake of exclusion and exploitation and discrimination by the Jim Crow structure in New Orleans. So that's important to understand this kind of context about what's going on. Zulu's popularity will grow in the ensuing decades, especially among African American working class. Black New Orleanians, especially members of the working class, will largely embrace this organization. Louis Armstrong repeatedly told reporters that serving as the king of Zulu is the dream of young African Americans like himself growing up in New Orleans. And what you start to see is white New Orleanians will increasingly start to attend the Zulu parade, even though Mardi Gras is very racially segregated and African Americans are not allowed to be part of the official Mardi Gras. Whites will start to come to Zulu and to support it, including financially. Even at the height of segregation, tens of thousands of white spectators will watch King Zulu disembark on Rampart Street or parade on Black occupied streets. In 1941, Zulu themed their parade to commemorate the return of Emperor Haile Selassie to Ethiopia after 6 years in exile following the Italian invasion in 1935. Here's a really fascinating element that's taking place. For many African Americans, the defense of Ethiopia becomes a source of growing Pan-African identity and pride. And Selassie serves as a symbol of resistance to European colonialism and fascism. Thousands of African Americans will donate money and medical supplies to Ethiopia in their fight against Italy. And many will try to volunteer in defense of that country, which the federal government prohibits. But African Americans, including in New Orleans, they will hold rallies and they will send money and supplies and donations to Ethiopia in their fight against Italy. In 1937, the Louisiana Weekly, which is the most prominent Black newspaper in New Orleans, they will report that King Zulu sent his annual message from Africa to New Orleans for Carnival. And the yacht that year is named Selassie, and the newspaper states that King Zulu, quote, led the battalion of death during the recent Italo-Ethiopian War. And he told his followers that he's merely taking some time out to seek some carnival spirit here. The war, he says, is far from being over, and he must hurry back to keep the morale of his fighters at high. And he supposedly distributes war relics that he's taken from the Italians. So they're starting to incorporate elements into Zulu from this kind of growing sense of connection to Africa and a growing sense of Pan-African identity. And this is an interesting event to understand. Many African Americans see their own struggles against Jim Crow reflected in the fascist invasion of Ethiopia. They support Ethiopia's struggle with donations. They start to see a growing sense of Pan-African identity. But at the same time, they are still continuing to parade, as we can see here in 1941, using the standard costumes and floats that are kind of parodying Africans. So it's a lot of kind of weird and sometimes contradictory elements. And members of Zulu don't see a contradiction in supporting Ethiopia and still continuing to parade in costumes based upon tropes of Africans. However, others start to criticize Zulu. In 1941, African American leaders in New Orleans write an editorial in the Louisiana Weekly stating that, quote, no self-respecting person can point to one constructive contribution of the late Zulu burlesque. Opponents will argue that Zulu's performance fed into negative white stereotypes of African Americans. And so it's interesting to note, they're not saying that what they're doing to depict Africans is wrong. They're saying that by playing up these tropes, by kind of acting foolish and dancing around and, you know, dressing up like this, they are feeding into white stereotypes of African Americans as as kind of leisurely, as ignorant, as not interested in things that are serious. And so it's not the element of them negatively depicting Africans, it's the way that it reflects upon African Americans that's problematic. Many outsiders will view Zulu as kind of minstrel-like and as designed to appease white audiences, especially after the organization marches for the first time in 1946 on St. Charles Ave, which is a predominantly white neighborhood, although they're still banned from the French Quarter. And these attacks on Zulu are part of a larger critique of the performance of Zulu by African American groups that emerges in the 1940s. For example, there used to be a group, the Jack Zulu Hippopotamus Clowns, which is a New Orleans Negro League baseball team, and they are heavily critiqued starting in the 1940s. They wear grass skirts, wigs, all black uniforms, and they are critiqued for doing so. Similarly, there is a Knights of the May Zulu that is formed in Mobile in Alabama in 1938 that really kind of copies Zulu, and they are heavily criticized for doing this. They're called shameful by the Mobile Colored Carnival Association in 1947, and the crew eventually ends in 1952. So you're starting to see in the 1940s and increasingly into the 1950s, 1960s, criticism of Zulu for their depictions. Nevertheless, Zulu is still very popular, right? As I previously mentioned, Louis Armstrong says that every kid's dream, every African-American kid's dream is to be King Zulu, and he fulfills this dream in 1949, right? He tells Time magazine, there's a dream, a thing I've dreamed of all my life, and I'll be damned if I don't like it's about to come true, to be the king of the Zulu parade. After that, I'll be ready to die. And here he is, right? New Orleans' most famous son, coming back, parading as King Zulu in 1949. It's important to understand, though, Armstrong, who is one of the most famous, if not the most famous American in the time period, who becomes an ambassador of music and the icon of music in the 20th century, he comes back as Zulu, but can't stay at most of the city's hotels, can't eat at most of the city's restaurants, because they're whites only, even as they listen to his music and they go to see him as King Zulu. And also, some African-American leaders do heavily criticize Armstrong for parading in blackface as King Zulu. Increasingly into the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement kicks off in New Orleans and really intensifies, African-American leaders will criticize Zulu. The field secretary for the NAACP, Clarence Laws, calls for banning the parade in 1957 unless they, quote, exhibit more order and dignity. And he argues that the group ridicules the entire Negro race. That same year, New Orleans civil rights leader, Dr. Leonard Burns, asks African Americans to not spend money on Mardi Gras that year and donate instead to the United Clubs Fund, which will support civil rights measures in the city. And they hope that economic pressure, the denial of clothing to white merchants and halls and liquor stores, would help put pressure on the city to integrate and put more support towards civil rights. And they convince most of the African-American Mardi Gras organizations not to hold parades, not to hold balls that year. The largest holdout is Zulu. Zulu's president, Harrison Baker, defends the club, says Baker, they, quote, criticize us a lot. Even some of our own people don't like it, but I don't see it. I say we're not out to belittle anyone. We're just out to have a good time. And in a somewhat ironic note, Baker argues that Zulu canceling the parade would not actually redistribute Black money to the civil rights effort because white merchants are actually paying for the Zulu floats. This will become a major source of criticism of the crew, as some Black leaders will argue that whites are paying for this parade, which is mocking African Americans. The Chicago Defender, which is one of the most important Black newspapers in the 1950s, 1960s, they hold up Zulu's negative behavior as a means through which whites would justify white supremacy. And they write in 1966, quote, that King Zulu has been depicted as a drunk, undisciplined, but lovable bore, just the image of Negroes wanted by New Orleans racists to keep Negroes in their place. In 1961, leading African-American leaders call for a blackout of all Mardi Gras, for African Americans to skip altogether Mardi Gras as a protest against segregation in the wake of New Orleans school system's fight against integration. So here it is. This is the time period of the New Orleans school crisis. This is the time period of marches and protests, and the protests against segregation and Canal Street and then Dryad Street. And African American leaders call for Black residents to skip Mardi Gras, to protest against this, to call for integration. And they hope that instead of, again, spending money on Mardi Gras, that they can donate this money to the NAACP and their fight against segregation. Again, though, Zulu holds its annual parade in defiance of the boycott. The original king and queen are forced to resign when critics threaten to boycott their businesses. And significantly fewer African Americans came that year to witness King Zulu's traditional disembarking. But it does march, right? And for a lot of the Black working class members of New Orleans, they still support the crew. They still see this performance with pride. For them, Zulu is the one way that they can really enjoy Mardi Gras, despite segregation of Carnival, despite the city's segregation life in general. And others, again, support this idea that Zulu is actually mocking Rex, and therefore it's kind of a critique of the white Mardi Gras, and therefore it's a support of kind of integration and of kind of critique of the white power system. So here's a lot of kind of conflicting views. Black leaders of the city, including the leaders of the NAACP, will heavily criticize Zulu, will call for boycotts of it, will say that it is depicting African Americans in stereotypical ways. Some of the supporters of Zulu will say, actually, no, it's flipping the script on white supremacy. It's mocking Rex, and it's a way for us to actually enjoy Mardi Gras, which is traditionally segregated. So it's a lot of kind of division within that community over Rex. The call for the blackout does reach some success. In 1964, Dr. Leonard Burns, as leader of the NAACP, proposes infiltrating supporters into Zulu in order to change the organization from within. And by the following year, by 1965, this method achieved success. The new members seize leadership. They promise that year to abandon their use of blackface and African garb. They hold a, quote, more dignified parade that would reflect racial pride. And that year, King Zulu in 1965 wears an outfit of all white satin and a gold crown. They kind of drop the African, this Zulu garb, which actually leads to a lot of criticism by African Americans who now critique the performance of Zulu and say that it has become quote white, and that they've abandoned their tradition of ridiculing white stereotypes. In response to this blackout and changed costumes, white proponents of the crew and their traditional performance in blackface and grass skirts will then also kind of adopt this idea that Zulu is a lighthearted burlesque of Rex, and therefore does not ridicule African Americans, and that the old performance is okay. Again, there's a lot of elements to kind of unpack here. By 1967, Zulu resumes their traditional performance, though. They go back after 2 years of kind of dropping the traditional elements. They go back to their traditional elements. They that year try to put on a performance that, quote, according to their leader, will have a quote, real African parade inspired by the life in the African jungle. They have their old costumes, their old floats, but they also will feature some ways to kind of tie into Africa, including coins starting in the 1960s that will honor different African ethnic groups. We can see here the one from 1967, this Hausa ethnic African group, and you'll see this on a lot of Mardi Gras doubloons in the 60s and 70s. So here's what's going on, right? I mean, Zulu has been heavily criticized. It's gone through these elements where they've dropped it, they've readopted it. They're still facing critique by the civil rights organizations. They also increasingly are starting to face critique by groups that are saying, not only is this a negative stereotype of African Americans, but it's also a negative stereotype of Africans, right? You start to see here some groups starting to critique Zulu and saying what you're doing to depict Africans is wrong. In 1961, the All African Student Union of America presents a petition to the mayor of New Orleans that, quote, protest the misrepresentation of African culture and personality, noting that the Zulu farce threatened the good and friendly relations of the African American people, which we're building. This is going to be an element that you're going to start to see here. Right? In 1969, the African American Cultural Foundation, the Black Education and Cultural Society, and the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, among several organizations, released a signed statement that will very heavily kind of critique what they're doing. And say the Zulu members evidently have not done any historical research into their African heritage. They fell victim to those racists who found it their delight to finance and encourage our people to induce them to this act of self-debasement in their carnival festival, which affects not only the Zulu organization, but all Black people in New Orleans throughout the United States of America and the world. So you are starting to see a critique of Zulu from people who are arguing that it's wrong and it's damaging conceptions of Africa, and also the ties that the United States and New Orleans in particular is developing with Africa. So you are starting to see this. Despite this, though, Zulu regains its popularity. In 1969, municipal leaders will allow the crew to parade on Canal Street. This is the first time that city leaders allow a Black organization to partake in the official Mardi Gras route. By the 1970s, the crew starts to regain some of the members that it had lost, and many of the members, including civil rights leaders who previously critiqued Zulu and said that it's showing these negative stereotypes of African Americans, will actually join Zulu and become leaders of Zulu, and some of them will become king of Zulu in the 1970s and 1980s. It's important to note this is a time period of increasing Black nationalism and of a Pan-African identity. And despite this, you still have these elements of Zulu that are continuing into the 1970s and 1980s. There is another controversy, though, that erupts in the 1980s, and this has to do with apartheid. In 1986, the president of Zulu and the organization's float designer, Blaine Kern, who's known as kind of Mr. Mardi Gras, the creator of the Mardi Gras floats, they plan a trip to South Africa to meet with Zululand's prime minister and invite 50 South African Zulus to march in that year's Mardi Gras. So they actually want to take ethnic Zulus and have them come into Mardi Gras. As part of the trip, they also plan to bring some of their floats to South Africa and partake in their own carnival celebration. This planned trip faces a lot of criticism. It's important to understand what's going on at the time period. This is a time period when apartheid, this system of white supremacy in South Africa, is really at its height, and it is violently trying to crack down on efforts of Black Africans to fight against apartheid. A lot of places in the United States and around the world have started to boycott South Africa, including in places in New Orleans and Louisiana. New Orleans is actually the largest importer of South African goods in the 1980s. And African American groups and supporters of Black South Africans will start organizations, including this group, the Louisiana State Committee Against Apartheid, that are going to be calling for bans on importation of South African goods and to divest New Orleans from money from South Africa, from the apartheid government here. And they then are going to turn their kind of criticism to this planned trip to South Africa in the height of this, right? So Zulu wants to go do this parade at the height of this kind of critique of the apartheid movement. And in the wake of this heavy criticism, Zulu ultimately backs down. I'll note a couple other elements that take place in the 1990s real quick here. In 1991, in December of 1991, the New Orleans City Council passes an ordinance that calls for the racial integration of New Orleans Mardi Gras crews. Zulu is actually the first Mardi Gras crew that integrated. They integrated in the early 1970s, and they had white members. But most of the Mardi Gras crews, the traditional Mardi Gras crews like Rex and Comus, they are all white and all male. And Dorothy Mae Taylor, who is the first African American woman elected to the New Orleans City Council and a civil rights leader, authors this ordinance, which is passed by the City Council to require the integration of Mardi Gras crews. Otherwise, they could face fines or they would not be allowed to parade. And it leads to a bitter fight and a backlash against the City Council, and in particular, a lot of racist animosity directed against Dorothy Mae Taylor. And some of the old crews decide in the wake of this criticism to actually quit. As a result of this integration, you have crews, including Comus and Momus, who are both all male, all white. They announced that they're no longer going to parade rather than integrate. It does this backlash against the City Council. They kind of back down after 6 months. They decide to take away the fines. They decide to allow single-sex crews to march. It really only leads to kind of minimal integration of many of the kind of older traditional crews that continue to be predominantly male and white, like Rex. But Zulu increasingly adds more white members. By the 2000s, about 10% of the members will be non-Black, which I'll come back to in a second. The other thing that happens in the 1990s too is the end of apartheid in South Africa. And what this leads to is increasing ties between New Orleans and South Africa. Many of the South African musicians, Black South African musicians, will start to perform in New Orleans. And Jazz Fest, for their 25th anniversary in 1994, will feature some of the most prominent Black South African musicians who themselves were inspired by Louis Armstrong and New Orleans jazz. And so they start to incorporate these elements into this. And New Orleans hosts an African Heritage Festival, which includes South African musicians and performances of Zulu warrior dances. So what you start to see is over the course of the 1990s and the 2000s, increasing cultural and economic ties between New Orleans and South Africa. And still you have this kind of performance of Zulu going on. The other elements that we can kind of end with, certainly you have a big influence of Katrina in 2005, right? Katrina inundates New Orleans, 80% of the city floods, over 1,100 residents die, hundreds of thousands of people are scattered to 48 states as part of this large Katrina diaspora, and this includes many members of Zulu. Many of the members of Zulu reside in the New Orleans East and the Lower Ninth. It's some of the city's hardest hit areas. At least 11 individuals affiliated with Zulu die, in addition to 250 other members who are part of Zulu who are displaced. And many people are not sure what's going to happen to Mardi Gras and if they should even have a Mardi Gras in 2006. But they do. And it's seen by a lot of people as kind of this symbolic act of New Orleans coming back after Katrina. And what they do is they fulfill that quest, where in 1986, they wanted to have ethnic Zulu warriors. In 2006, they do have 20 people for ethnic Zulus who are marching here. We can see them depicted on the left, who come from South Africa and march and parade as part of Zulu, even as Zulu kind of maintains its own elements. So this is taking place here, even as New Orleans is increasingly developing these ties here. We're starting to see these kind of mixing of these elements of actual ethnic South African Zulus marching along with white and African American dressing up as these Zulus for the parade. The last elements I'll note for Zulu has certainly endured its share of issues in the past several years. In the wake of photos of white officials, including the governor of Virginia, Secretary of State of Florida, and police officers in Baton Rouge, being white people being published in blackface, facing a lot of criticism, there was increasingly, again, return to critique of Zulu, especially because, like I said, about 10% of Zulu's members are non-Black, and most of them are white. Of these 10% are white, and they wear this kind of traditional or stereotypical Zulu dress, including elements of blackface. And it's still something that has received a lot of criticism as a result of this. This is a press release that they put out in 2019, where Zulu says that they're wearing black paint, that they differentiate this from blackface itself, and they say that it is not racist. So it's kind of one of the interesting critiques that are still taking place in Zulu right now. And the last thing I'll mention too is, the most recent thing that has happened, of course, is the impact of COVID. Again, Zulu was hit hard by COVID. A number of the organization's old members died from COVID. And it's had a really big disproportionate impact upon that organization. Zulu continues to parade to this day. It still, wears a lot of the kind of same traditional elements, the Zulu warrior dress, the kind of blackface or black paint, and the white elements around the eyes and the mouth, the grass skirts. Also note too, Zulu, although it's most famous for this, it is still operating as a social aid and pleasure club that are prominent in the community, that deliver Thanksgiving meals, that participates in Toys for Tots, that hosts Night Out Against Crime, that helps students get into college and pay their way to college. And they continue to pay for funeral services as kind of their origins as the social aid and pleasure club. So I will end my talk with Zulu there, and I'll open it up to any questions.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Kevin McQueeney, for your presentation. As I mentioned earlier, if you could put up your questions in the Q&A function, you'll see a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That allows us to look at the questions all in one place, and I will be fielding those and passing them on to Dr. McQueeney. So first question, how did the erroneous celebration of 12th night on the eve of January 6th, rather than the eve of the 5th, which is the eve of the Epiphany, I guess the question is, how did it move, the 5th being the actual 12th day of Christmas?
I am not, even though I am kind of somebody who really enjoys the history of holidays, and I'm not quite sure what are the elements that lead towards that being moved from the 5th to the 6th. That's something that New Orleanians, have kind of incorporated into this. I mean, a lot of that history goes back much further back than Mardi Gras, and there's a lot of it is also based upon the differences between the Christian Orthodox Church and then the Church in the West, and they all have different dates too. There's also a lot of different dates that are based upon interpretations of the Bible and when the arrival. So the Three Kings Day is supposed to mark Epiphany. This is supposedly when the three wise men arrive, and so that date has been changed continually. We've kind of set upon that as that kind of start of this Epiphany, this celebration of this Three Kings Day. But that's just the date that we have continued to kind of mark and start as the official start for Mardi Gras. But a lot of that goes back, I mean, way further than the start of Mardi Gras. I mean, I'm talking thousands of years for some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is, is there a place for women in Zulu?
So yeah, Zulu, for a long time, many of the crews were all male. Zulu does start to incorporate women in the wake of this in the 1990s, although, this is still kind of one of the elements that you see with Mardi Gras, is that in the wake of the 1991-92 ordinance, they faced such fierce blowback that the city decided to get rid of that requirement that you have gender integrated crews. So you still to this day have a lot of crews that are, either all predominantly men. You also have several all women crews. So Zulu, I think, is one of the first organizations to really start to kind of incorporate different elements of gender. Like I said, up until the 1930s, the Queen of Zulu was actually a man, and then they started to incorporate women into this in the 1930s, which is, again, decades before any other organization, any of the other traditional crews are starting to use women as part of its elements. They're starting to incorporate this. A lot of this is more having to do with the parade and allowing riders in the parade versus members of the social aid and pleasure club. So there's kind of like a little bit of a separation from this. And you can kind of become a rider. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be part of the traditional social aid and pleasure club. And you do see this a lot at Mardi Gras, where they will invite people to be part of this. Former mayors, right, including Mayor Landrieu was invited and he was part of Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club. And this has been one of the critiques, one of the sources of controversy for this, especially when you have white politicians or white figures who are then putting on elements of black paint or blackface. That has led to some of the enduring critique of this, and which I think is really, really fascinating. And you do have a lot of prominent African Americans in the city who defend this and argue that this is kind of something that's okay within this element. That blackface itself is racist, but because of the kind of traditions of this is okay. But I mean, yeah, you still do see a lot of these kind of issues about gender and race still within this the parading and masking for Mardi Gras and for Zulu.
Absolutely. I actually have a question of my own that kind of connects to some of the comments you were just making, both just now and at the end of your presentation. You mentioned that at one point there was a statement that the paint wasn't actually blackface, that it was like literally black paint. And it does seem from the photographs, it's hard to discern, like there might have been a gradual process of sort of increasing stylization of the face paint. Would you agree? And would you be able to speak to sort of like how that developed and what you think the points along which it developed?
Yeah, I mean, you will see that the kind of traditional way that it used to be, right, for minstrel shows was typically somebody would paint their face with black, and then they would put the white circles around their eyes and around their mouth. And now what you start to see this really in like the 70s, and in the 70s, Zulu starts to say, we're not mocking Africans, we're not actually doing an African performance. And they start to kind of incorporate more elements. I mean, they do increase things like red and greens, which will be as part of their kind of face paint as well. So you just start to see this. I think part of this is a way to kind of differentiate themselves from this minstrelsy of the blackface. You do have the kind of traditional elements of that, which are, like I said, the blackface and the white rings around the eyes and the mouth. And you can see that, some of the Zulu warriors, the ways that they kind of dress up now don't use those elements as much. I mean, some still do. I can share my screen again, just from the, from here, from 2006, right? You can see in this case, right here, the figure on right, still using the kind of white around the eyes and around the mouth, which is still kind of a hallmark of it, versus this person on the left is a little more. And then we can kind of come to here, again, it's still incorporating some of these elements, but some of them are a little more stylized, some of them are a little more kind of individualized. I'll go back to that release, right? And they talk about this, right? That blackface, that it's a racist depiction of this, right? That it's based upon stereotypes of Africans, and the black makeup is not the same as blackface, right? And this is a press release that's put out by the organization. Not only do they put this out, it's endorsed by the leaders, including Cedric Richmond, who's a member of Congress, the leader of the Black Caucus within Congress. And so you do have leaders who are endorsing this and who are differentiating, painting their face black versus blackface. But still, I mean, like I said, you do have a lot of critiques because it's not just African Americans who are part of this crew. It's whites who are being invited to parade with it, who are then putting on blackface. And it has led to some pretty big controversies, especially I would say in the past 5 years. I think there's been a lot of this in the wake of, the governor, like I said, the governor of Virginia, when the pictures of him in blackface when he was in college or medical school come out, there's a big conversation about blackface and whites dressing up in blackface and how this is still pretty common. And it's seen as very much kind of something that you would not be acceptable, except for in Zulu. And so it's again, I find myself in kind of a position where I'm not critiquing them or criticizing them. It's just, there is certainly people who will critique this, including African American leaders, right? Some of the leaders of organizations like Take 'Em Down NOLA have critiqued and continue to criticize Zulu and say this is still kind of a racist or stereotypical depiction. So I think part of it is based upon who you are and where you're at. And I think for the people within Zulu, they are kind of able to kind of see this as a different form. And for people outside of it, some people have still see this as a form of minstrelsy.
Makes sense. So we have another question here from our audience. One of our viewers has a great presentation, and they're curious if you have done any research on the Coon Carnival in South Africa in Cape Town, where there is likewise influence from minstrelsy and blackface.
It's just vaguely. I mean, Amy, you might even be able to speak about this more than I would, because I know you kind of do a lot of the international elements of Carnival. I mean, I know they do this, and they also do, pretty minstrelsy based depictions of African Americans. Part of it is, part of this is actually coming out of a springboard between New Orleans and Africa and South Africa, especially increasing in the 20th century, when African American culture gets spread, especially through jazz, when you have the proliferation of records and recordings of this with phonograph and recordings in the 19 teens. This gets brought over as part of the shipping elements that gets brought over to South Africa and other parts of Africa. And then you start to see these elements, including Carnival and their celebration there in South Africa. And I'm certainly not an expert onto that, but that is definitely one of the elements that is critiqued also about then including Zulu as part of these like elements and marching as part of this. And again, it's some of it is designed to kind of critique or kind of mock the white racist stereotypes of African Americans or of Africans. But there's a lot of elements to kind of unpack there, and they still continue to do this. And I mean, I don't know if you can speak to this too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific tradition, but I can definitely say that, like, in my more America's focused research, like lots of examples of both African descended people dressing as caricatures of Africans with or without face paint, and instances of both African descended people and white people wearing blackface in various carnival traditions, and similar discussions sort of, arising out of it, and, arguing for it as an instance of carnival inversion that's only acceptable at that time of year, because that's the whole point of the festival, is to like thumb your nose at convention, all convention. So it does get complicated in a similar way, and evolves under very similar kinds of circumstances and tensions. So
yeah, and I think that's one of the really fascinating things about Carnival is that the context about the moment that's taking place in Carnival will reflect that larger discourse conversation about race, about white supremacy, about the elements that are going on in society at that time period. Zulu comes in and out of favor based upon what this conversation is about: civil rights and segregation and integration in New Orleans. And when Pan-African identity and Black nationalism becomes popular, that affects the way that people view Zulu now. And the way that people are talking about racial stereotypes and this kind of reckoning, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. There is a conversation that people are having, and people are applying this to Zulu, and it's really fascinating. And like I said, I think a lot about that moment in the '60s, where some leaders are saying this is depicting Black stereotypes, but a lot of African Americans in the city are saying, well, this is actually a parody of the white stereotypes of African Americans, and here's a way that we can pillory them, and this is the time period when we can. And traditionally, you can't, because you would be subject to white violence and to white supremacy. But here at this moment, we can. So, a lot of ways, I think it just depends upon your perspective and what is the dialogue that's taking place at that particular time period. And I certainly know other societies, including Brazil, which you studied, has some really interesting ties to this and some conversations that they've had about race and what that means in their society. Similarly, in South Africa, I mean, they've had a lot of ties about this too, and it can be jarring. I mean, sometimes you see this, you see what's going on at Carnival, you see, I went to Zulu this year. This was something that Mardi Gras had not happened for several years, and I went to Zulu. I live near Zulu. I live in the 7th Ward, and I live pretty, about a mile from Zulu, and I live a couple blocks from their parade route. And it's still really kind of jarring sometimes to see those elements of this. And I'm not sure quite what to feel, especially as a scholar of that. But it's an important institution and an organization, and so I think it's a fascinating dialogue to still have.
Yeah, and so much of the meaning of it too lies in the nuances of the performance, not just the costume itself. And it's so hard to know without extensive footage that we can view from within the cultural context of the time, and like fully understanding all the nuances of the facial expressions and the vocal expressions. And so, that also contributes to the huge breadth of possibility for interpreting a performance. And I imagine that in many ways, like many performances, that ambiguity might have been, if not like fully consciously intentional, like part of something that was enjoyed and cultivated.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, especially at a time period when African Americans are not allowed to critique the white power structure, that ambiguity they have to have, because that provides some type of defense for them. Yeah, it's fascinating. And like you said, right, I mean, you can't know the intentions of the performers. I mean, we'll never really know, what we know about like the Tramps with their performance that they saw in 1909 is based upon stories that have been passed down. It's based upon newspaper accounts of this, and then it's oral tradition passed down to other members of Zulu. And so there's also a lot of layers, a lot of history that's removed from this. So like I said, I come to this as a historian and outsider who has read these accounts and gone through the newspapers and looked at the pictures, but I'm not somebody within that crew itself or the Social Aid and Pleasure Club, and they certainly might have a different interpretation or a different way of viewing that original performance and what that performance means today, and that's very fair for them to do so. This is just based upon what I've been able to kind of gather as just somebody, a scholar looking at it from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question about the motivation and the choice of depicting a king of Zulu. The audience member points out that was the real king of Zulu in Africa involved in selling his people into slavery, and so what is informing the choice to then depict him? Is that something people are aware of, or is he chosen simply as a symbol?
I mean, I think that he's chosen as a symbol because, well, for a couple reasons. Because the chief of the Zulu warrior becomes this kind of iconic image of what a warrior is. Especially, like I said, Shaka Zulu, right? I mean, this is somebody, even people who don't know or study African history, this is kind of like a name that you might have probably heard of because it becomes kind of this mythological figure. And that war in 1879, which is led by a Zulu chief, he's kind of revered as this great warrior fighting against the British, even though the British are kind of seen as superior. here is this kind of great defiant stand. In a lot of ways, I think Americans kind of view it the way that they view indigenous people in the United States. And so they consume this and they start to accept this element of the Zulu warrior, but then also the Zulu chief. The king element, part of it is because they did one of the numbers that they did, we know based upon the oral accounts of that and the newspaper accounts of this, is that they had this a song that was about the king of the Zulus. And a lot of times in these vaudeville performances of Zulus, they would have this, they would have like a king or a chief. And sometimes the king chief is just like a different, it's a not necessarily dichotomy, it's just a different way of viewing this, the king versus the chief. In some ways, this is why people argue that Zulu is similar to Rex, because Rex has a king. I'm not quite sure, which is true. I think both potentially could be true. I think they might have seen it and said, okay, they've got a king in this vaudeville show. Rex has a king, this has just become kind of a royalty. They do incorporate other elements. Like I said, they'll have like the big shot or the witch doctor gets laid on, again, kind of playing into these stereotypes of this. But this king element, I think, is really, really fascinating. And part of it is just this kind of historical respect, I think, or historical imagination of what the Shaka Zulu is, or the Zulu chief, the Zulu warrior is. Part of it, like I said, too, is that story, the Star of Zanzibar, there's a number of stories that are being told at the same time period. This is the same time period as Garvey's Back to Africa movement starts to gain popularity. And so there's a lot of conversations about Africans going back to Africa. And then there is, kind of pushbacks against this. And you start to see this being reflected in like the vaudeville performances. And then in those performances, sometimes then the African American who goes to Africa will meet the Zulus and become the king of the Zulus. And so, there's a lot of weird mixings of this about American conceptions of Africans and Zulus in particular, and applying their own terminology and their own labels, their own ideas. So I think it's kind of hard to really figure out why exactly they go with the king, not, the Zulu chief.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I can provide a bit of context from my own area of research, because I sort of touched on this issue in the context of Brazil, where African royals are depicted as well. That, first of all, depicting royalty in royal courts was just super common in carnivalesque celebrations, not only pre-Lenten carnivals, but saints' days as well. And so this was sort of a go-to throughout the Americas. And then likewise, so the history of the involvement of African royals with slavery is very complicated. I don't know the specific history of the Zulus. My area of focus was more connected to the Kingdom of Congo. But I know that, some African royals did indeed sell their people into slavery, and some did not, and some regretted having done it or wanted to backtrack from the decisions of their fathers or grandfathers. And it was very complex, and African societies were hierarchical, as almost all societies have always been. And so that is, it's a very complicated and nuanced issue and part of the history. And I suspect that almost none of that was in the popular consciousness in the United States in the early 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think certainly some African societies, some groups in the starting in the 1500s are part of this. There's elements of African conceptions of slavery, although it's a very different concept. It is not plantation slavery. It's more based upon capture during war and incorporation into existing cultures. I don't know specifically for Zulu. I've studied them some, but I can't really remember off the top of my head their involvement in slavery like this. But yeah, it's highly unlikely that anything like that would have influenced their concept or their idea of this, that people would have been aware of that, or about having this conversation about Africans being involved in the slavery conversation. I think a lot of it is just based upon the popular concept of the king of the Zulu or the warrior of the Zulus, and that gets incorporated into this. because that's just the image. It's what they've seen. It's what they've talked about, and also just like what has become known as this really popular stereotypical, trope. If you said a Zulu to somebody in New Orleans in the 1890s, 1900s, they'd probably have a pretty good idea of like what that concept means. It's not like you have to explain what you mean when you say somebody's like acting like a Zulu. They would know it meant something, just because that's just like such a popular term in the time period.
Yeah, it sounds like it becomes detached from actual Zulus and takes on a life of its own as this almost independent symbol and point of reference.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So someone is asking, is there any relationship between the Zulu crew and the Mardi Gras Indian tradition? And I would say I would take that further in the sense that even if there's not a direct relationship in their development, there do seem to be a lot of commonalities, including in some of the debates about them. So if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, the elements are kind of really fascinating because right. So for Mardi Gras Indians, for those who are not familiar with Mardi, people will dress up as Mardi Gras Indians. These are traditionally African American crews, and they do so because they are meant to honor this history where indigenous people would help enslaved people, self-emancipated, who escaped to freedom. They would welcome them into the tribe, and they would help them in maroon colonies. And so African Americans started dressing up as Mardi Gras Indians as a way to kind of honor them. I think in some ways I can see the connections too. And the connections that I see too is that normally people dressing up as an indigenous people, it's not usually seen as acceptable. And for those organizations, and a lot of them are descendants of indigenous and then African Americans, they do so as a kind of way of honoring them, not as mocking them. And so it's a little bit of a different angle. In some ways the Zulu thing is, some people could argue that it's honoring them, but in some ways, it's based upon this vaudeville kind of trope mocking of them, versus the Mardi Gras Indians are a way of kind of honoring this historical legacy to this. Mardi Gras Indians are a big part of that, and Zulu does do things with second lines and parades, and St. Joseph Day is such a big event here in New Orleans, and Mardi Gras Indians are such a big part of that culture. I don't think there's necessarily direct involvement with those two different ideas coming together, but I think that it does show about how Mardi Gras is a reflection of this history, both real and imagined. And sometimes it leads to these kind of depictions of this coming from very different streams. But in a lot of ways, I mean, you could take a look at Mardi Gras Indians and then the Zulu warrior, the Zulu, and they have a lot of the same elements. They kind of look somewhat visually similar to this day. And so that's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And another one of those practices that Kevin and I have talked previously, the place in Brazil that I do research in has all these like practices that are oddly similar to New Orleans practices. This is another one where there's Afro-Brazilian performances as indigenous Brazilians, and a little bit of a different sort of oral history of the reasons why, but definitely, diasporically connected. So I think we have time for one more question. This is submitted as more of a comment, but I think it's rich for you to elaborate on your thoughts on this. So this person points out, I think it's worth acknowledging the huge inspiration that Zulu has been, especially to the newer wave of carnival crews. The coconut specifically has inspired coveted throws in many crews: Muse's shoes, Crew de Jeu bagels, T-Rex pecans, and Crew de Jeu in particular has taken up the parodying of stereotypes with their royalty. Big shot. I'm going to definitely pronounce this wrong. Big Macher. Not going for the French assumption here, as I've learned living in New Orleans. Witch doctor, rich doctor.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that Zulu has definitely served as kind of an inspiration for a lot of these organizations to then critique, especially a white power structure or a system of patriarchy, by using some of the same elements, by incorporating that. And it's something that people then recognize and then understand how they're parodying them. They created a language, they created a way to critique things, and then other crews have taken that and then used it and then created their own elements for this. And yeah, the coconut then inspires, yeah, things like Muse's shoes, and those are, these like really desired items for this. And right, Muses has in a lot of ways, incorporated a lot of these elements of kind of critiquing the all male structure of a lot of these Mardi Gras crews, similar to how Zulu was. We're going to have an African American crew when we're not allowed to partake in Mardi Gras. We're going to form our own organization. And so I think that, yeah, that's a really, exciting and really fascinating way that you can kind of see these ties. People get inspired by this challenge to this structure, and regardless of the vaudeville origins for this. I mean, Zulu is an organization that serves as an institution against white supremacy in New Orleans for 100 years, and that self-help organization, that model of helping out the community, and then also critiquing and parodying that, I think it's an important element for New Orleanians and for people to use that and to unpack that, and then to take that language and to use that to continue to critique white supremacy and patriarchy in New Orleans, which is still a major problem, and you see with a lot of the existing Mardi Gras crews to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last question for you, actually, I lied. How can folks get in touch, follow your work, learn more, etc.?
Sure. So if anybody would like to, I will actually share on my screen this time. So anybody who wants to get in touch, here's my email. If you would like to email me, I'm also on Twitter. I'm not as active as I should be, but I do love Twitter, and if you contact me, I will try and get in contact with you. So yeah, please feel free to contact me, to tweet at me, send me a DM, or to send me an email. I am happy to communicate, and I love talking about New Orleans history. So yeah, if you have any other questions or comments, and a lot of my talk was based upon a paper that I published in Safundi, which is a Journal of South African American Studies. And so if anybody's interested in that, I'm happy to send them a version of that. I think it's been enough years that I wouldn't be in copyright violation. I can only send them something like the page proofs where I probably would not be in copyright violation. So I'm happy to send you that too, if anybody is interested in that.
Wonderful. Well, let's give another round of virtual applause to Dr. Kevin McQueeney. And on behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, I would like to thank Dr. McQueeney for speaking with us this evening. For information on the upcoming lectures in the Gallier Gathering series, including next month's lecture by Dr. Michelle Foa, titled Degas, New Orleans and the Transatlantic Cotton Trade, please visit www.hggh.org. And I would like to once again thank you all for your continued support of our museum, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Gallier Gathering. And thank you, Dr. McQueeney.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was wonderful to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise.